Good evening, Assalamu alaikum, Namaste, and Sat Shri Akal. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to the 7th Muhammad Ali Habib Distinguished Lecture on Pakistan. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Munis Farooqi. I am the Director of the Institute for South Asia Studies and also a faculty person in the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies. I also happen to be the person who is going to implore you to please turn your little devices off for the duration of the talk. So if you could please do so, I'd be very, very grateful. Before we go any further, please join me in welcoming Professor Chris Taylor to Berkeley. He has flown all the way from Karachi, Pakistan to be with us tonight. Professor Taylor is the Vice President of Academic Affairs and the Dean of the Faculty at Habib University in Karachi. You'll be seeing and hearing a lot more from him over the course of this evening, but let me just say that Professor Taylor was a Dean of Faculty at Drew University before joining Habib. He's an Islamicist, an extremely well-published author, with interests in not just contemporary Islam, but also in medieval Islam, specifically questions having to do with sainthood. So if I could please just ask Professor Taylor to stand up and acknowledge our applause. So just to give you a sense of how grateful I am to Professor Taylor for coming today, Wasif Rizvi, who is the president of Habib University and, in a sense, my co-conspirator on the Muhammad Ali Habib Distinguished Lecture Series here at Berkeley, was supposed to come out, and then he got pneumonia. And I believe it was on Wednesday evening that Professor Taylor got his marching orders to come to the United States, and is actually here and in one piece and seemingly still awake. So welcome. As the director of the Institute, I am called upon to participate, introduce many talks, many events every year. The annual Habib Distinguished Lecture Series, however, does really hold a very special place in my heart. And here is why. Its creation marked the first step toward the establishment of a Pakistan Studies Initiative here at UC Berkeley in 2013. And really building off the foundation of this Distinguished Lecture Series, I would argue that we have really been able to construct a dynamic Pakistan-focused ecosystem at the Institute for South Asia Studies at Berkeley. Among its many component pieces, in case you don't know them already, we have an endowment that supports consistent Pakistan-related programming. We run the Berkeley Urdu Language Program in Pakistan, which is the only American-run Urdu-intensive semester-long program of its kind in Pakistan. In fact, right now we have a cohort of 11 students from across the United States who are studying intensive Urdu in Lahore at Lums University in our program. Then there is the annual SS Pirzada Dissertation Prize, which is given to the best doctoral dissertation focused on Pakistan in the social sciences, humanities, law, public health, and visual or fine arts. And again, this is a dissertation that is not exclusive to Berkeley. It's a dissertation prize that anyone, anywhere in the United States, Canada, and Europe can apply for and hopefully receive. We also have a Pirzada Distinguished Lecture Series, which is focused on Pakistan, which we hold every spring semester. And most recently, UC Berkeley has become a go-to place for an annual Fulbright conference that brings over 100 Pakistani Fulbrighters to campus every year around April or May. The way in which the Habib Distinguished Lecture Series has served as a catalyst for these and other opportunities, to my mind at least, speaks very highly of the Habib family and the Habib Foundation's willingness to think expansively and also imaginatively by supporting the mission of institutions like Berkeley. And of course, in doing so, they are living up to the fine traditions set by the founder of the House of Habib in Pakistan, the man whose photo graces this occasion, namely Muhammad Ali Habib, seen to my left over here. Allow me to say a few quick words about Muhammad Ali Habib. By all accounts, he combined a generosity of spirit and dedication to civic engagement with a very deep love for Pakistan. Under his tutelage, the Habib family became synonymous with the building of schools, the financing of a wide array of charities across Pakistan, and even bankrolling the treasury of Pakistan when it had cash flow problems in the immediate aftermath of partition in 1947. To my mind, UC Berkeley, with its driving commitment to social justice, excellence in public education, and its deep engagement with the world, is the perfect place to host the Muhammad Ali Habib Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm so grateful that the Habib family and the foundation agreed with this assessment some 7 or 8 years back. But there is a second reason why I'm particularly invested in the Habib Distinguished Lecture Series. You see, since its inception, year upon year, this lecture series has brought some absolutely amazing speakers to campus. They have included Asma Jahangir, the noted but now sadly deceased human rights lawyer, Aisha Sadiqa, perhaps one of the most astute observers of the Pakistan Army, Christoph Jafralo, whose book, The Pakistan Paradox, is probably one of the best recent books on Pakistan, Mark Kanoya, who's a very renowned scholar of the Indus Valley, David Gilmartin, probably the world's leading historian of pre-partition Pakistan, and most recently Raza Rumi, an extraordinarily brave journalist and one of the most intelligent voices on contemporary Pakistan. Today's speaker, Professor Atif Mian, fits perfectly within this distinguished roster. In brief, he is reckoned by many in his discipline of economics to be one of the sharpest and most insightful minds around. Indeed, he is, and I'm going to embarrass him here a little bit, sometimes whispered to be a future Nobel laureate for his groundbreaking work on household debt, economic inequality, and his Cassandra-like prognostications that something needs to be done immediately about income inequality and inequity to prevent rising worldwide political discontent and disruptive populism. Whether a Nobel Prize ever comes to pass or not, just the fact that some speak about Professor Mian in this manner attests to the kinds of superlatives that invariably surround any mention of him and his work. As a historian, I'm always drawn to biographical narratives, and so allow me to share a few highlights regarding Professor Mian's life. He was born in school in Pakistan. After graduating at the age of 17, Professor Mian came to the United States as an undergraduate. He was at MIT. He has described receiving MIT's letter of acceptance as, and I quote him here, one of the happiest and luckiest moments of my life. I like the luckiest part. As well as a heady exposure to life beyond Pakistan, MIT thankfully did one more thing among others to Professor Mian. It drained him of any interest in majoring in engineering. And thank God for that. Instead, Professor Mian found himself gravitating toward mathematics, computer science, and eventually economics. A PhD in economics at MIT followed, then distinguished academic appointments at the University of Chicago, and since 2012, Princeton. Fun fact, between 2009 and 2012, Professor Mian was a professor in the Department of Economics at our very own UC Berkeley. And no doubt some of his finest thinking occurred right here. Which he then, like so many others, took to one of the Ivies. Anyway, jokes aside, much of Professor Mian's work has been focused on studying household borrowing and debt toward understanding an economic system that has become, in his view, terribly distorted by widening income inequality. In so doing, Professor Mian, as well as interlocutors and co-authors, men like the University of Chicago professor Amir Sufi, have attempted to show that a dramatic rise in household debt among borrowers least able to repay, rather than failing banks, actually helped precipitate the Great Recession of 2008. And so by helping banks rather than indebted borrowers, policymakers delayed everyone's suffering while fueling income inequality, the continued concentration of wealth, and easy credit and consumption that now seems to largely come at the expense of real investments in the economy. In this country, the particular effects can be seen in everything from burgeoning child hunger to high incarceration rates among African American men, to low public investment in infrastructure and education, and even the rise of Donald Trump in 2016. It is precisely the use of microeconomic techniques to answer really big macroeconomic questions that has undergirded so much of Professor Mian's work. And lest you think that such obsessions don't translate to other aspects of his life, allow me to share a wonderful anecdote about Professor Mian with you. It's one that caught my eye as I was beginning to write up today's introduction. It appears in the September 2019 edition of Finance and Development, which is an IMF published journal. So allow me to just simply read. It's much easier that way from the text itself. And I quote, Mia's wife of almost 20 years, Aisha, jokes that the pursuit of efficiency prevails even in his personal life, manifesting itself in an obsession with quote-unquote space utilization around the house, during frequent evenings hosting guests. If there's a 3-seater sofa, he wants 3 people to sit on it. She says with a laugh. And she goes on to say, but if there are 2 people sitting comfortably on it, he sees it as inefficient. Small things like that, he just cannot get out of his head. And if a 3rd person fails to fill the allotted slot, well, you can see the pain on his face. Anyway, if you've spent any amount of time in Professor Mia's company or watched his talks on YouTube, you will be struck by his deep commitment to the idea that the well-being of a community or society depends on all individuals thriving. To quote him, when we talk about stuff like the Great Recession, it really matters that we are able to absorb each other's shocks, that we realize how we are all ultimately connected to each other. It is precisely this kind of empathy, as well as a lack of disciplinary, even political timidity, that are the hallmarks of his career thus far. It is precisely these qualities that led so many of us to applaud Professor Mia's appointment by Prime Minister Imran Khan to the Economic Advisory Council of Pakistan. And needless to say, Prime Minister Imran Khan's decision to revoke Professor Mia's appointment following pressure from right-wing and sectarian Muslim outfits was deeply disappointing. More so because Pakistan now more than ever needs the likes of Professor Mia to not only help right its teetering economic ship, but also create a context for long-term economic growth and hopefully broader-based prosperity. Before concluding, and on a slightly more personal note, today's talk really does feel like a true squaring of life's circle for me. You see, around 10 years ago, I began conversations with my friend and colleague, Professor Saba Mahmood, about establishing a Pakistan Studies Initiative here at Berkeley. There was one problem, however. Our ambitions were contained by the simple fact that we had no money. And against this backdrop, a certain colleague of ours, someone who was then in the Department of Economics, offered us over $12,000 as seed money out of his very own personal research funds. And lest you're confused and scratching your head as to who this savior is, it's none other than Professor Atif Mian. 8 years later, the Berkeley Pakistan Studies Initiative is thriving, and in no small measure to the seeds that Professor Mian allowed us to sow. Unfortunately, Saba Mahmood did not live to see today, but no doubt, wherever she is, she is sending you Atif her salams and thanks. On that note, please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Atif Mian to the podium.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you very much, Munis, for that very heartful introduction. It's indeed feels terrific to be back in my old hometown of Berkeley. Yesterday evening, I was sitting having coffee at Strata, and for a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. It was exactly the same. I could even see some familiar faces who would always sit there. They were still sitting there. So it's great to be back, and thank you for having me. I must thank the South Asia Studies Institute at Berkeley for hosting this wonderful event, and of course the Habib family for both their generosity and their commitment to public purpose. I hope I'm able to say something which is of use to you and others who may be listening online. But I must also give a special note of thanks to all of you who are here in the audience. As Munas has already mentioned, it was tough competition. You could have gone to the Junoon concert, but you chose to come here. That says something about you. While the rest of the world might laugh at your decision, I personally am very, very grateful that you considered it. I was listening to some of the conversation on social media, and somebody was saying to his friend, "Oh, you can hear Atif's talk later online. I'm sure it will be videotaped." And I thought to myself, "What about Junoon songs?" But anyways, I'm glad you're all here, and thank you for that. I was actually nervous that I might be the only one here. Let me start. Let's talk about the topic, which is how to fix Pakistan's economy. It's not an easy task, but at least at the minimum, I want to just think along with you about this question, because it's a very important question, and I'll come to the importance of that towards the very end. But first, to understand where the economy is now, I want you to just think of a sort of a thought experiment. Imagine that we were all engaged in designing an airplane, and we take it for a sort of a test takeoff. And every time the plane takes off, it hovers in the air for a while, but then it stalls, nosedives, and crashes into the ground. If you do that repeatedly, and every time the plane crashes, there's only one conclusion you could reach. And that would be that there is some fundamental flaw in the design or the engineering of the plane. Something not that different has been happening with Pakistan's economy. To give you one stat, in the last 60 years, Pakistan's economy has literally crashed 13 times. And every time it has required a bailout from the IMF. So it's basically every 3-4 years. I mean, I know ever since I've been alive, I've been hearing this over and over again. And so if you were to define the state of Pakistan's economy, I think the more apt adjective would be that it's not an ordinary economy, but it is a crashing economy. That is, something is built into it that it crashes every once in a while. It's not a bug. It's a feature of the design that the economy crashes. And so we need to understand what that is. This is kind of the work I do when you look at this kind of repeated evidence. So I'll talk about that. But one thing I want to say up front is that the consequences of the economy not working, which obviously Pakistan's economy is not working, the consequences are extremely dire and severe for what really matters, which is for the humanity that lives in that great country of ours. Just to give you one statistic, in 1980, which is not that long ago, Pakistan was actually the richest country in its peers, among its peers of Bangladesh, India, and China. About 40 to 60% richer income per capita wise than these three countries. However, since 1980, largely because of the kind of tipsy-turvy sort of economy that it has had, now Pakistan is the poorest of these three countries. China, just to give you one example, is 500 times richer than Pakistan. India around 60% richer, and as I said, Bangladesh is richer as well. So something not right is happening with the Pakistan's economy, and one point to take away from this is that if things continue the way they have since 1980 onwards, there's a real danger that within a generation or so, Pakistan will become an economic ghetto of the region. And that has very problematic repercussions of all magnitudes and dimensions. And so it's really the extent of the problem is important to understand before we move forward. But let's move forward and try to understand what is wrong with that plane, that it keeps on crashing. And so if it were literally a plane, obviously you would open up the black box and try to look inside it. If you did something like that with the economy, I would argue that there are sort of 4 signs or symptoms, or perhaps flashing red lights to continue with the metaphor, that are important to keep in mind And hopefully those symptoms will then tell us what the underlying disease is that we need to look after. The 4 symptoms that are worrisome, the first one of those is that Pakistan is a country that has extremely low investment rates. So again, imagine that the economy was a farm. If the economy were a farm, Pakistanis invest, for every 1 seedling that Pakistanis invest in that farm, countries like Bangladesh, India and China are planting 2 to 3 seedlings for every seedling that Pakistan is planting in their farm. That's how low our investment rate is. Now, of course, if that's what we're doing year in, year out, it is only understandable that when it comes time for harvesting, Pakistan's crop is going to be that much less than that of its peers. Right? So it's a fundamental problem is the very low investment rate. That's symptom number 1. Symptom number 2, which is important to keep in mind, is the fiscal problem. And to give you the extent of how deep this fiscal problem is, I'll give you a couple of numbers. The first one is that for every dollar that the federal government raises on net in revenue, it has to spend $2.75, or maybe I should say for every rupee, it spends 2 rupees and 75 cents. Imagine you have an income of $1,000 and you are spending $2,700 every month. How is that possible? Well, of course, it's not possible without an incredible reliance on borrowing. But just to understand how deep this fiscal problem is, the dollar, or again, let's go with the rupee, that the Pakistani government raises, 1 rupee and 25 paisas, that is more than the revenue that it's collecting, actually goes to paying for, let's just call them, the past sins of the country, which is the interest payment and the pension liabilities. So again, this is like you have $1,000 in income and your paycheck comes and first you pay just the interest on your mortgage and then you owe something to the gardener who worked for you 10 years ago, you pay his salary that you owe, and already you have to borrow an additional $250 just to do that, and now you have to decide what to eat and how to do that. If Pakistan does not borrow, literally the entire military will shut down, the entire civilian government will shut down, there will be nothing to invest in infrastructure and other needs of the country. So it's a country that is running literally on borrowed money. And of course, you cannot run a country like that. The third symptom that is important is the weak balance of payment problem. And that is simply a problem that Pakistan imports a lot more than is able to export to the rest of the world. And again, just to take the 2018 numbers, for every dollar that Pakistan earned through exports, it imported $2.25, so more than 2 times. And again, where does the gap come from? Some from remittances, but the rest from, again, borrowed money. The fourth symptom that is important to keep in mind is the liquidity problem. It's not just that Pakistan is sort of addicted to borrowing to run its normal set of affairs. That borrowing is in debt that has extremely short maturity, on average 1 to 2 years. Just to put this in perspective, the average maturity of sovereign borrowing for other emerging markets similar to Pakistan is around 8 years. It's a very short maturity. Now, what does that mean? That means that this incredible amount that you have borrowed, you have to entirely refinance it every year or two, the entire amount. It's like you have to refinance your entire mortgage every year or two. The bank might do it, the bank might not. That puts you in a very precarious, fragile situation that you are constantly under the hammer of what international agencies are going to say to you, what the financial markets how they might react to you, to various news and so on around the world. All of this leads to something very important, which is a loss of sovereignty. It's really a fundamental question of sovereignty or independence, if you like, which obviously every one of us cherishes a lot. But the way the economic situation is right now, it is difficult to say that we are completely a sovereign country. Anyways, all of this was a discussion about the symptoms. Let's now get further into the diagnosis, because these are symptoms ultimately. The real disease is something else, and we must look for that. In my view, the recurring problem or disease, if you like, that has led to these kind of grave symptoms is what I would call a tendency towards short-termism or myopia. Successive governments in the past. This is not about People's Party, this is not about Nawaz Sharif, this is not about the military. Across the board, they have all behaved the same, which is why we are where we are. Now, one glaring example, let me give you some examples to illustrate what I mean by this particular disease of short-termism or myopia. It's been the ruler's tendency to just come up with new ways or just try to discover new ways to mortgage the country's future so they could borrow a bit more and show some shiny projects to the people as a sign of this artificial growth. And so the labels or the causes of this borrowing keep changing. Sometimes it's US, sometimes it's Saudi Arabia, more recently it's been China. But we go to the Koreans to build the motorway for us, we go to the Turks to build the bus service for us, and now we go to the Chinese to build practically everything else for us. You cannot run a country like that. At some point, it's a natural question. What is it that you can do? And it's the result of this tendency to rely on these short-term boosts, which are politically expedient, because it makes you not think about the hard choices, and I'll come back to that. The time has come, it had come long ago actually, but they need to make the hard choices and have to let go of this tendency of short-termism and myopia. But this sort of search for easy money is just one way in which this disease of myopia manifests itself. Let me give you a few more examples. I already mentioned the unfunded pension liabilities. I'm still paying for the gardener that I hired 10 years ago. If they were looking forward, the natural thing to do is to fund the pension liabilities that are going to come when the gardener retires. But there has absolutely been no focus on that whatsoever. To the extent that now we have a problem that if people continue to retire, obviously, that this hole in the fiscal books will become bigger and bigger and bigger. But again, myopia prevented us from funding these pensions that should have been funded. A third example would be, let me give you a recent example. A big thing politically, which was announced as if it is a big success story, which was the 18th Amendment. Devolution of power to the provinces. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. Education, health, among others, they are now under the purview of the provinces. They do as they please. Perfectly fine. But the manner in which it was done was entirely fiscally irresponsible. Because while 18th Amendment guarantees pass-through of little over half the federal revenue to the provinces so they can spend on health and education and so on, there is no revenue-raising commitment from the provinces. So of course, if you give people money that they are not responsible for raising, you're going to have a problem. And this is one of the reasons, the numbers that I gave you in the beginning, which were at the federal level, this is one of the reasons the federal numbers are looking so terrible. Because half the gross revenue is going to the provinces and they are not raising sufficient revenue themselves. The last example I'll give again to convey this short-termism is on the socio-political side, which is how the country's future generations were literally mortgaged. So this was not a financial bad decision, but this was a political, terrible decision that just to support the US-led Afghan war in the 80s, an entire generation of Pakistanis, they were bombarded with propaganda of an extreme sort. Their minds were corrupted, sectarianism was introduced in Pakistan, extremism and violence was introduced into Pakistani literary schools and madrasas. And that has had a terrible repercussion, as we have seen that over the decades, from 80s to the 90s to the present day. What were they thinking? I just can't believe. Why would you be so stupid to literally give away your youth in this madness? And no one raised a finger, apparently. So again, these are the, when you want to look at why we are where we are, this unfortunate tendency that we observe among some commentators in Pakistan that it's always some conspiracy theory or you blame this or that or the other. First, we must look within ourselves. And only then can we move forward and correct what has been wrong. Let me now come towards the cure. As I said, the disease has been manifested because of this focus on short-termism and myopia. The cure naturally is to reverse that. And I would define it as developing the capacity to play the long game. Our rulers and the ruling class and the decision makers, they need to change from this habit of only thinking in days and weeks and months and changing to the habit of thinking in decades and centuries and plan for that. If you just think like that, it will become natural to you, the silliness of some of the decisions that have been made in the past. You would have never made those decisions because you would ask yourself, where will this particular decision lead us 20 years from now when no one will care about the Afghan war, and so on. So let's think along those lines. What does it mean to think about the long game? At a basic level, thinking about the long game is a way of rephrasing something very fundamental, which is nation building. This is exactly what nation building is. Because again, the horizon of nations is not a month or a year, it is decades and centuries. Someone has to talk about who we are as a nation and where we want to go. That important conversation needs to take place. Since I'm going to focus on the economics, let me just say, to start that conversation, what I think is again kind of the central theme around which you build the long game. That central theme, in my view, is what I would, again, bit of a technical term called focusing on boosting domestic productivity. That's all that matters at the end of the day. Whatever decision you are trying to make today, ask yourself, is it something that will boost domestic productivity? What does that mean? That means raising the capacities and the capabilities of your people. If it is doing that, go ahead full steam. Otherwise, do not do that. If you just thought like that, you would understand that asking the Turks to build your motorway, asking the US to fund you for the next 2 years, asking the Chinese to build everything in your country is not doing any of that. Because you're not focusing on building domestic institutions, you're not focusing on building domestic capacities. I'll tell you one reason why they don't focus on that. Because doing domestic capacity building is hard work. It means you have to build teams, you have to build institutions, you have to hire the right competent people, then you have to give them discretion, you cannot be nepotistic, so on and so forth. It's much easier not to do any of that and knock on some foreign power and say, can you please give us this on a turnkey basis and we are with you. There is a famous Chinese proverb that I really like, which essentially makes the same point. It says, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach him how to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Unfortunately, we have been handing over fish to our people, which other nations have been handing over to us, and we have been just passing this along. What we really need to do is a change of mindset where we finally begin to learn how to fish. And once we have done that, as this proverb says we'll be able to feed ourselves and our generations to come. So how does one boost domestic productivity? How do you teach yourself how to fish? Again, this is a long and deep discussion. I don't want to bore you. But I do want to highlight just some broad conceptual parameters that will help us in thinking along those lines. The basic concept, or one of the basic concepts in boosting domestic capacity or capabilities, is that you want to focus on activities that facilitate fundamental inputs to the rest of the economy. That is the stuff that you want to focus on. So some of it will come out quite naturally. So think of an educated workforce, a healthy workforce. So education, health. They are fundamental inputs that every firm would want to hire decent, healthy, educated workers and so on. So invest in that, that's the natural. But it also tells you something about which sectors of the economy you may want to focus first before others. And again, if you think of it from this perspective, almost exactly the opposite is done to this day. So what are the sectors that one would prioritize if you think from the perspective of boosting domestic productivity? A natural first, in my mind, would be agriculture. It's a sector that touches the largest number of people in Pakistan. It's a sector for which the main capital, which is the land, is already there, so you don't have to go to the countries for borrowing. It's also a sector where people have some expertise, some experience. It's also a sector in which, unfortunately, we are doing quite poorly. The productivity levels in agriculture are quite low, and we know how to make them higher. This precision agriculture, this leveling of the field, is targeted watering of the plants efficiently and so on. We need to move in that direction. Build the domestic capacity to invest again. We need to invest a lot more, and agriculture is one of the first sectors where a lot more investment should be targeted. So productivity levels can rise, and the advantage of the agriculture sector is that it will start to solve some of the other symptoms that I've already described. Because agriculture is a tradable sector. So if you become more productive, you will import less of it and you will export more of it. Naturally, this pressure on balance of payment would naturally start to go down. Just to give you a contrast, rather than thinking like this, governments often turn towards housing schemes and things of that sort. It makes no sense given the symptoms that Pakistan is facing. Housing is not an exportable commodity. What expertise are you going to develop in housing construction that will help you in solving, for example, the balance of payment problem, or for raising productivity for that matter? So again, it's the conceptual framework within which you design your policies is very important. The mindset of thinking about the long run is very important. And we have yet to make those processes part of our governance mechanism, part of our decision-making process, which is why we continue to make bad decisions year after year. The other sector which is natural for boosting productivity is renewable energy. And this again illustrates how there has been no thinking about long term in Pakistan. I have known since I was a child that we have an energy problem. I remember this horror, someone telling me, you know what, there's going to be no electricity by the time you are in middle school. We all knew this. And yet the country made no investment in developing its own capacities where the natural would have been renewables in the country. We keep relying on imported coal, imported oil and so on. And then we do it in a manner that makes it even more terrible than it otherwise would have been. For example, the IPPs is the classic case of that. You allow people to invest to generate electricity and then you promise to pay them in guaranteed dollar returns. So you are consuming electricity domestically, it's not generating any dollar revenue for you, but you will pay dollars to pay for that electricity. Obviously, you're going to have balance of payment problems. Again, time after time, what is missing is the scientific approach to decision making. What is missing is the seriousness with which these decisions need to have been made, the seriousness with which competent people should have been part of making those decisions and deciding, is this the right strategic play for Pakistan? Or maybe we should have done what the Chinese understood a long time ago, again a country that did not have oil of its own. It started investing heavily in renewables, producing its own solar panels and so on. And Pakistan happens to be the place where it has one of the best places in the world in terms of scope for renewables. Solar, because of the angle of the sun and so on, it's a terrific place for that. Lots of room for wind and so on. But again, no capacity has been developed to that. So renewables is a natural way you would want to focus on. The last industry I would mention along those lines is big data and data science. It's clearly happening everywhere around the world, but I want to emphasize just one element of big data. It is something, remember I said we want to think of fundamental inputs that touches every sector, that has synergies, that has a multiplier effect for the rest of the economy. Again, big data, data science has that advantage. Because every field, every industry is going to use it. It also has one other advantage, which is really key for policy makers and policy design, which is the fundamental problem you have when you are designing economic policy, especially in a sort of a cash-starved country like Pakistan, is you're trying to maximize some objective, like providing healthcare to the most people or education and so on, while given finite resources, right? And this is exactly the problem that data science solves for you, which is making decision-making more efficient. Where should I invest so the machine learning algorithm will tell you, this is where I predict you will get the biggest bang for the buck. And you can make enormously better decisions if you proceed scientifically again by first building that data infrastructure, which is quite easy to do if you actually put your mind to it. Let me now move on. We've talked about the symptoms, we've talked about the disease, we've talked about the potential cure, focusing on productivity and so on. Let me now move to what is the last question I'm going to talk about, but it is also the most difficult question. And that is, okay, we've figured out what to do, we're all ready, we're all passionate. How do we do it? Implementing change. This is the hardest problem, but again, not a problem one cannot address. The way I would solve this problem, again, the problem is implementing change. How do you actually bring about change? I would classify the solution to this problem as, since I was once a business school professor, and I like terms which are kind of catchy. So I'll just call it the 5 C's of governance. Okay? I made it up. It's not, don't Google it or anything like that. I just literally made it up last night. What are those 5 C's of governance? The first and the most important C in my view is courage. You see, when a country is in the midst of the kind of problems that Pakistan is, there is one thing that you should logically just deduce automatically, which is, if it was easy to solve this problem, someone would have done it. So it's not easy. Because, we may think these politicians are corrupt and so on, but remember, these politicians have an enormous incentive to win the next election. So I think, they do, while they do all the stuff that they should not do, at the same time they are, for whatever space is left, they do try to use that space to fix the economy so that they can show to the voters that we have done this or that. They do care about it. But they have not been able to do that, obviously, and it's important to keep it in mind. It's not going to be an easy decision. I've had conversations with people who matter, and they say, yeah, these are hard decisions. Let the economy settle down, and I promise you will handle this hard decision. They don't get it. They don't get the causality. They have it completely wrong. You take the hard decisions first, then the situation will change. Everyone from Musharraf onwards has been trying to do that, living in a fool's paradise. Let me get a lucky break and I'll fix things. No, you fix things and you will get the lucky break. So that requires courage. Because when a system is as perverse as unfortunately the Pakistani system has become, there are these entrenched groups within the country who are benefiting enormously because things don't work. Because when things don't work, those who have power, those who have connections, those who have access to arms, those who can, bully people along, they make the most money exactly in those environments. So when you talk about change, they will come after you. They will politically threaten you, they will physically threaten you, they will do everything in their power to stop you. And so it is not easy to talk about change. Either you don't talk about change, but if you do, you better have the courage to pull through. What do I mean by this courage? I'll give you some examples again, just to illustrate this point. I told you one of the problems was this fiscal hole that Pakistan has. So how should one raise taxes, raise revenue? I'm going to try to explain to you a somewhat of a technical issue, but it's really an important one, I feel, which is that in a country like Pakistan, one of the really efficient ways to raise revenue, and when I say efficient, I mean it in the economic sense of the word, which is to say that you'll be able to both raise revenue with less corruption, and the raising of the revenue will not negatively impact economic activity either. And so what is that form of taxation? That form of taxation is if the government introduces land tax, which is a tax on land, but just the land itself. I'm not talking about the structure or the building on top of it, just the imputed value of the land. Why is it efficient to tax land? Well, because no one does anything to create land. It's God given. You can't add an inch of land. Whatever is there is there. So whatever value land gains is not because of I am doing something to it. It's because of what everyone else is doing around it. So if it happens to fall in the middle of the city, obviously its value will go up a lot, so on and so forth. The point is, the value of the land is not somebody's property in the sense that they worked on it to create it. And so it's relatively efficient if you have to tax some activity. This is actually a good tax some value. This is actually a good value from that perspective to tax. There's actually a theorem, it's called, if you want to Google it, you can Google this one, which is, it's called the Henry-George theorem, which basically says that if you were to tax land in the way that I've just described, the value, the revenue generated from that is actually sufficient to pay for all of your investment infrastructure needs of the city. You will not have to raise any other revenue. It's a very powerful force actually if you were able to implement it in practice. But this is where courage comes in, because every powerful person in Pakistan owns land and they love owning land. So God knows how you are going to do it, but if you have courage, we'll at least talk about it. The second point, again on this topic of having courage that I would focus on is fighting for women's rights. It's obviously a good moral thing to do, but I'm here as an economist, so I'm not going to moralize on this. But it makes perfect economic sense to fight patriarchy, to fight for women's rights, and to protect the interests of women in Pakistan. And the situation of women is, really nothing much to speak of. So we really do need to do much better than that. But why do I say this is important for the economy? Let me try to make that point. I'll try to make the economic argument for why fighting for women's rights is the right thing to do if Pakistan is to go anywhere economically. Pakistan has one of the lowest female labor force participation rates in the world, even relative to countries like Pakistan, like Bangladesh and others. So it's really bad. But it's even worse when you consider the following. A couple of researchers, Tahir Andrabi and Niharika Singh, they have shown in this wonderful study that, not that long ago, in 1985, there were less than half as many girls as boys enrolled in intermediate, which is like high school in Pakistan. However, by 2013, the situation had completely reversed. Girls or women had made so much progress in education that by 2013, there were more girls than boys enrolled in intermediate. So you have the quantity. But it's not just that. On the quality dimension as well, girls are beating boys hands down. The same study shows that girls are doing much better than boys academically. For example, they are 33% more likely to get the highest grade, which is A+. So think about that. Contrast the reality of what girls and women are doing in terms of their achievements academically, and contrast that with the lowest labor force participation rates in the world. Something is wrong. It's not like Pakistan is a rich country and these women have the luxury that they can just, sip tea and whatever. They are not working for a reason. They are not working because you are putting obstacles in their path in so many different ways. You are not giving them any support. Not only that, you look down upon people like the late Asma Jahangir who do raise this issue, and you call them all kinds of names. Have we lost all sense? Do we not ask ourselves the question of what is the long game that we are after? What is it that Asma Jahangir has said that we find so troubling that it questions our masculinity and we must put her down and must abuse her and things of that nature? This has economic repercussions. We have failed to understand this point, that we don't have the luxury to design our own laws of nature. As an economist, I think of economics as the study of laws of nature. You do the right thing and you'll get the reward. You act stupid and you'll face the result of stupidity. So just to again put some numbers to this, I don't have time to explain, but it's relatively straightforward. If Pakistan worked on improving the status of women in the society and increased female labor force participation, for example, literally over the next 10 years or so, hundreds of billions of dollars will be added to the economy. That's the kind of scales we are talking about. Of course, the scales will be this high because we are talking about half the population. You cannot grow and compete with the rest of the world while you have shackled and put back half of your population. The third important point that will require courage, if anyone is truly interested in making long-term change, is fighting religious bigotry and clamping down on the purveyors of hate that we have, not just sanctioned, but actually nourished over the years and over decades. It should have been abundantly clear, and it should not have taken any rocket science or the rest of the world to make us understand that it is in your own self-interest that you must treat all citizens of Pakistan equally regardless of whatever background they may have. And if you were to have the courage to say these things, it's not like you have to appeal to some French philosopher or, American novelist or anything like that. All you have to do is talk about Jinnah. All you have to do is, if you like to talk about religious scripts, then talk about the Quran. You have to just talk about the message of justice, equality, and the message of La ilaha illallah, that there is no compulsion in matters of faith. But again, we don't have the right mentality. You're not thinking straight. You're not thinking about the long term. You're not thinking where we are heading. And if anyone did that for a moment, they would be doing things differently. That was just the first C. I have 4 more to go. The second C that is important, again, we are talking about bringing about change, is competence. I've already talked about building domestic productivity, and as I said, that's hard work. It's not easy. It's actually, for the US, perhaps our president is showing that to us, you don't need very competent people to run the US. Because the systems are already in place, it's like so things are working and so on. But to build a country like Pakistan, you really need very competent people. And so the government better develop the capacity to bring competence in, but again, that's not as easy as it might appear. You might say, yeah, sure, hire the best people. But it's not as straightforward. So there are two things you must do to incorporate competence in your governance systems. The first one is you must be able to identify who is competent or not. It's not an easy problem. But you must develop that capacity, which means you must read a book now and then. The second ability that you must have to inculcate competence in governance is that after you have identified competent people, and this is equally important, you must give them real authority and discretion. Otherwise, what are they going to do with their competence? They might give you the best ideas, but those ideas are going to go to some bureaucrat or politician who either doesn't understand it or could care less. You must put the competent people in charge, and then, universities in the US have figured that out. That's why we don't have bureaucrats running universities. We have academics who understand what running a university means, running universities. The third C that is important for building governance is credibility and commitment. So two C's, but I'm combining them into one C. What do I mean by credibility and commitment? Let's say you've had the courage to say the right thing. Let's say you've been able to hire the competent people, given them discretion. Fine. But economy runs on expectations. When a business person is deciding how much or whether to invest in Pakistan or not, they are not just thinking about, are you making the right decisions today? Obviously that's important. They are also thinking the following: is this decision going to survive 5 years, 10 years down the road? So you have to now think about building commitment and credibility in your system, governance system as well. And again, just to continue with my university example, if you were improving governance mechanism of universities, obviously you would want to bring competent people, but then you would want to give credibility to those people. How can we do that? You will appoint the best people as board of directors, but then you will give them autonomy, you will give them legal cover, you will give them legal authority. This is where institutions come in, this is where regulation comes in, this is where law comes in. So you must think seriously about that aspect of government as well, with the goal of again adding credibility and commitment to the governance mechanisms. The fourth C that is important is coordination. The country is a complex place. An economy, one should always think of an economy not as an atom, but as an ecosystem. Because you have many things interconnected, and you must take that into account when you are designing policies. And so you need to coordinate policy along the various dimensions which make up an economy. Just to give you one simple example, if every province has its own sales tax, you want to make sure that there is no double incidence of taxation, that because an activity goes from one province to another, it's taxed twice. You will kill that industry in the process. So things of that nature, you need to coordinate and avoid kind of silly mistakes of this sort. The final C, and it's one that is, I said the first one was very important, this one also is very important. And that has to do with compassion. We must not lose sight of why we are arguing about all of this. It's not about GDP numbers. It's about the people who live on that piece of land, and governance must recognize that and must show that they have that compassion, that they care about the people that they are governing. Another reason for that is that governance at the end of the day is a social contract between the governors and the governed. And if you develop that governance mechanism with a sense of compassion, you will see that the people will reward you back for it. You will not have to threaten them and punish them and force them to do this or pay taxes and so on. They will start doing that automatically because they will understand, this is us trying to do good to us. But again, getting there requires a change in hearts that sometimes we find lacking in the people who matter. I've said everything that I wanted to say in terms of how I view this problem of how to fix Pakistan's economy. I'll just close by again bringing the focus back on why we should be interested in this question. It's not out of any nationalistic pride or anything like that. The reason I like economics is because there is the hope that perhaps one day, by using logic, data, and so on, one is able to do things that help someone's life, that you're able to lift someone out of poverty. By avoiding making silly mistakes, you're able to help someone get an education and chart a different path for themselves. So it is for that reason that we really need to focus on this problem, with that level of commitment that we need to focus on that problem. And when I talked about courage, that courage needs to exist not only in the rulers, it needs to be there within ourselves as well. Because sometimes reform does require personal sacrifice as well. And I really hope that sometime along the road, we are able to make the change that we need to. I should say at the end, that while I've been kind of negative and caustic and whatever you want to call it, that's not how I feel about the future. I'm a fundamentally optimistic person because I feel what gives me optimism is that nature is always trying to egg us along in the right direction. And all of these bad things that I narrated in the beginning, they're actually nature's way of telling us we're not doing the right thing. And as I guess every nice thing is Chinese, I think it's a Chinese saying, right, that crisis is an opportunity as well. In that sense, I think we have to change because there is literally no other option. We're running out of options. We cannot live the way we have been living in the past. So I am very optimistic about the future. We just need to do more of these events. We just need to have more of these conversations. And once again, I thank you very much for your attention and for coming here. Thank you.
Moving the program along, I'm going to invite two individuals, Dr. Chris Taylor, who I already spoke about, who is the Dean of the Faculty at Habib University, and Umair Khan, who is a Silicon Valley-based angel investor, chairman of Folio 3, founder of the Mentors Fund, as well as many other things, to come up and have a conversation for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then a Q&A, basically geared toward the audience will follow.
I'll take the first question. So, very impressive. Thank you for the floor. Particularly loved the 5 C's. So, my first question is for the NIA government. Are they getting straight C's on the 5 C's? How would you grade? These C's to the next was bੜੇ non PTI के लोग बैठे. So, would you start with courage? And there was an honest assessment.
There are certain questions where the sole purpose of the question is to get the other person in trouble. So that's the first question that a man has thrown at me. Look.
We'll get to competence later.
Yeah.
We're starting with the easy one first.
I don't know whether to grade on the curve or whether to grade on...
What is the sense of interactions? And then we all know about the Economic Advisory Council. What is your sense?
I think the first thing, again, to realize is, like I was talking about the symptoms, that it is a fact that the current government came in a very bad situation. I mean, it's not really the ideal situation that it's your first time in power and you're handed this collapsing ship, right? So they did inherit a very serious problem. I think the jury is still out. They have to take the midterms and the final exam. So let's give them a chance. One has to be patient. You don't want to judge too early. So let's give them a chance and hope something happens.
Very political economics answer. I just have a follow-up on that. I think some of us are obviously concerned that while they did inherit big trouble and all that good stuff, do you think that, with obviously the rupee devaluation, inflation, but also NAB accountability, it seems like things are getting really frozen here, right? There's a bit of paralysis in people, including folks like me who have businesses there. We're a little concerned and on the sideline, should we invest? Something comes up, all of that fun stuff. How do they get out of this, at some level, sort of, self-perpetuated frozen economy?
No, I think you're right on that. Like again, in terms of what is reality, we don't know. But as they say, perception is reality, right? Especially in terms of forming expectations of people like yourself or who are trying to invest and so on. And on that, if you just take it as that, the perception of sort of the way sort of NAB is acting and the perception of it's better not to do anything within the bureaucracy, you very clearly get that sense because the bureaucrats are saying, well, if I do something, then there's an excuse to catch me, so might as well just sit on my table. Nobody can put me in NAB for just sitting on my table. But then things don't get done. So there's clearly, that's clearly an issue, and I think again this comes back to some of the things I was talking about in terms of putting competent people, giving them discretion, giving them space. That's about the credibility and commitment of the thing. And so that's clearly a problem, and I don't think somebody is not understanding that issue. In terms of the adjustment, the exchange rate and so on, a lot of the adjustment has happened, which had to happen. There was just no two ways about it. I think that's where there are some positives, I think, on that, because I think the central bank, for example, is acting more independently. It's sort of putting in place a regime which is going in the right direction. There are a lot of issues that need to be sorted out, especially on that credibility and commitment side within central banking. A lot of the technical issues need to be hashed out, but again, I think they have made most of their adjustment. But again, I think it comes back down to addressing the fundamentals, which is boosting productivity. And on that, we are not yet seeing what we should have been seeing by now.
I'd like to go back to your opening analogy about the crashing plane for a moment and ask a question about, might there be a group of people who might have a vested interest in crashing plane? People who fix planes, for example, might want the plane to crash on a regular basis. And flowing from that, I know very little about Pakistan, but I lived in Egypt for many years, and I see a number of parallels between Egypt and Pakistan, particularly the role of the Egyptian military. I want to be clear, I'm talking about Egyptian politics and economics here. I do want to get back into Karachi on Monday evening. But in Egypt, the military controls a large amount of the economy, somewhere between 20 and 50%. And I was just looking at statistics while you were talking and seeing that the Pakistani military owns about 50 corporations that do over $20 billion worth of $20 billion worth of revenue last year. And so I just want to ask you about this question about vested interests and where that might go in terms of change.
Let me address the vested interest question first, and then we can talk about the military as well. You're absolutely right that it is in someone's interest to crash the plane. Another way to think of that is that, again, if you go back to the symptoms that I was talking about, imagine, I'll just cook up a story, but then what you will realize is that it's not cooked up, it might actually be quite close to reality. So, imagine a country where there is a group of entrenched, shady people who are involved in rent seeking. They're grabbing other people's money one way or the other that doesn't belong to them, and they're getting rich doing all of that. What will happen in such an economy? Well, money will keep getting accumulated in people who are not very productive otherwise, right? Because they can't do anything. All they know is how to steal in a sophisticated manner. So in this country, productivity will be low. In this country, investment will be low. Because not only do these people not know what to do with this money, they are snatching it from others who do know what to do, so they are also less likely to invest. So investment will be low in that country. But also because these people are not very productive, the country will not be able to produce much that it can export. But all the money that they have stolen, they would like to buy the nice stuff from the rest of the world. So this country will have a balance of payment problem as well. And finally, of course, the shady people will not pay any taxes, right? So you have a deep fiscal problem as well. So you can see that this is pretty much what is happening in Pakistan. So part of the reform process is exactly to change that, right? It is the symptoms are telling you that this is what I just described to you is not a cooked up story. Seems to be quite close to reality. So you need to address that. You need to figure out that who invests, they get their return and no one else can gain value from their return. This is why I was saying, if you have to tax land. You will stop speculation in the land. Land is not investment. In Pakistan, you're going to ask someone, what's the best investment? They'll say invest in land. Well, land actually is zero investment. It was always there. It's still there. You just increase the value of it. That's just a financial transaction. It's not real investment. Simple stuff like that. We need to understand that. And then guide the policy to move people away from this useless activity and force them into actual activity, which is creation of businesses, services, and all of that stuff. Your other question on the military, you see, that's actually, look, again, I don't want to be political or moral here. I don't care whether a company is run by the government, the civilian government, or the military government, and so on and so forth. The reality is that if you look at South Korea, for example, it was a country which was ravaged by war. It was a country that had very high defense expenditure to GDP. It had a huge army. General Park was running the country literally. And yet things worked out. General Park was the start of the rise of Korea. I'm just giving you, not because I have any love for the military, but I'm an economist. I like looking at evidence. I like looking at data. And I'm not going to, pursue a thread just because it appeals a certain point of view, politically or otherwise. So, we can talk about the military when, if you tell me in what ways military is harming it, like for example, I talked about land. When you start taxing land, I'm sure military will not be happy, but I will still say tax land. So I think there is another point that I just want to put across. When we have these conversations, we should have these conversations in a way that we try to build a broader coalition, that we're all trying to solve the same problem. And sometimes it will be Umair's fault, sometimes it will be my fault, it will never be Chris's fault, but it will be one of us, right? So that's how we should really discuss these things, rather than labels the ye ghaddar hai or ye chor hai or whatever the rest of the stuff is.
You've talked about IMF and structural adjustment. You said the trick is to reduce the demand for imports without slowing aggregate demand and output too much. How do you do that?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. That's why it is precisely the difficulty of this question that a smart country, again, it comes back to thinking long term. If you're thinking long term, you put in place what we generally refer to as macro-prudential regulations, the right exchange rate regime, to prevent these kind of episodes from happening. And again, the Chinese have been very smart about this. That's the reason that they have not allowed the country to have a net inflow of foreign currency to build those liabilities. So they always build their reserves on the side just to make sure that they have enough resources in case their currency comes under attack and whatever. But you need to develop those kind of macro-prudential regulations as opposed to what the previous government was doing, which is the imports are going through the roof, exports are going down, and you're still holding on to the exchange rate as if it is some gold standard that we have to adhere to. So that's number one. Now, but given that you are in this bad situation, what is the best way to respond? Well, the exchange rate must adjust. There's just no, can't do anything about it. You hope that exports show more resilience on the upside, and so they cover some of the difference as opposed to the import contraction that is coming through demand. But the other thing that you can then try to do is, this is why I was focusing on things like agriculture and so on. Because the nice thing about agriculture is by nature it has a very short cycle. Crop cycle is like 4 months or something like that. So you can get the impact very quickly. So you want to be smart about it, and you want to kind of put resources in the right places. Similarly, you can think about sort of distributionally, because most of the imports are more coming from the high income people. So you can ease the pain on the lower half of the population and maybe add it to the top, because that's what we need under these kind of circumstances. So that's the sort of stuff we would want to focus on.
So I think the one C that your upcoming best-selling book, the 5 C's of governance, should include, and the one C that I think we're all very familiar with in Pakistan is corruption. There are lots of ways to obviously address it, and certainly everybody gives lip service to addressing corruption. I think this government has shown, I don't know about courage, commitment, credibility, but they've shown certain amount of focus on that. How would you prioritize? Right? Is it political reform? Right? Is it judicial reform? Is it bureaucratic reform, including police and so on? If you could do one, what is the biggest lever to actually fight corruption and this hypothetical country that you were talking about, where people were taking money from other people and whatever fiction you talk about? How would you? Which of these would you prioritize? And so on, whether it's on effectiveness or ease.
So I deliberately did not put that C of corruption in. It's not because I like corruption. The reason I did not put that in is because I prefer to think of it as governance or misgovernance. I think that's the important question, as opposed to corruption or the absence of it. Let me try to push this a little bit more, because I think this is an important point. What do you mean by corruption? Corruption is, technically speaking, it's a legal term. But misgovernance, you could do stuff legally and it's totally misgovernance, right? So imagine the following. Imagine that, I like something that Umair is wearing. I could just steal it from him, that would be corruption. Or I could change the laws and regulations in my favor, so he is forced to sell it to me at fire sale prices, right? There's a lot of that going on in Pakistan, and that actually is a lot more dangerous than sort of the other form of corruption that we might think about. For example, when people put in restrictions on competition, when people put in subsidies in the budget for certain industries, or they erect protection barriers and then they make a living off that, or they do insider trading, they figure out where a road is going to pass and they buy that land before, or they get government land and they give it to their officers, class and so on, and throw away prices. That's not legal, but it's misgovernance. So I think that's how, number one, we should think about it, and it's not about corruption in whatever legal sense of the word. Obviously, you let the legal process take its course. I'm not saying, but it should not be kind of the be all of conversations day in and day out.
But in terms of political reform, right?
Yes.
Or strengthening the judiciary, or potentially again trying to reform the bureaucracy. Where do you think, is it all of the above? Is there any priority that you have in mind that would actually fight this misgovernance that you're talking about?
Well, it is obviously at some level all of the above, because they're important. However, I do think that judiciary is extremely important. And if you can fix judiciary starts solving a lot of your other problems. Because if you have justice at some level, it forces everyone else to behave. But if you don't have justice, that's kind of a free of all, it's a law of the jungle and that sort of stuff, right? So yes, if you were to prioritize, I would start with judiciary, but what were the rest of it as well?
You've also talked about Pakistan's need to invest in human capital, and particularly in education, to make the labor force more productive. But you also pointed out that as labor forces become more global, sort of global talent rises to that level, that they demand free and open societies. So what role do you see this as the demand for education and increasing capital?
Yeah, no, it's an extremely important point because, when I was talking about building stuff in the country, right, we need that. And the thing about building is that if you want to build a company, a university, a hospital, you want really very capable people at the top. Otherwise, it's not easy. And just take my occupation, academics. The reality is that given the size of the youth population, you need an incredibly large number of highly qualified people in colleges and universities to be teaching to that population. And they just don't exist, again, because of our mistakes in the past. You will have to, just give an example of that, we have to import, sorry to put that language on me, we have to, let me use a different word, invite. We have to be really hospitable to, people like Chris. We have to be really inviting to them. And not just Chris, but other Pakistanis who may have left the country. You really want to create an environment where you welcome it. And I get kind of annoyed when I see that, the Saudi XYZ or the Chinese XYZ is coming and you have fighter jets, whatever, whatever. I'm like, why are you giving these people so much importance? Why can you not give your own people and others like Chris, give them the red carpet and say, come build our country for us? Because it's about prioritization. What are you thinking? Those people are not going to build the country for you. At best, they'll give you a loan and they'll demand it back 2 years from now. And what they're doing on the ground will not have the capacity to pay it back because it's not going to produce any exports. So we must work towards inviting the best human capital in the world into Pakistan and show it with credibility and commitment. So it must come from the top. And when they come, we should send our fighter jets to invite them.
Just a last question on. So you have a whole bunch of folks here who are, I'd say, Junoonis for the Pakistani economy and the betterment of the people there. So, no pun intended. What can we here do while we're here? What's the best use of our time and acumen? And as part of that, I obviously know about SERP. I don't know if everybody here knows about it, but broadly on that and specifically on SERP, what can we all do to help?
I think one important way in which is, I was talking about this problem of governance, right? And it's a problem of social awareness of all of the issues that we talked about. I think it's important to get involved. It's important to try to make your voice heard. It's important to organize. I think we as Pakistanis, we sort of underappreciate all of these things. In general, I think we need to learn to be bolder. We need to learn to have sort of pride in who we are, and then also be, having that proactive sense of we want to change things, and then whatever is your expertise, you work in that manner. So obviously, there's not one thing that we want to do. In the little domain that I have, and since you mentioned SERP is called Center for Economic Research in Pakistan. It's a little shop some of us created about 10, 12 years ago now. And the reason, this for creating this thing was that we were trying to do work in Pakistan, and what we realized was there was no space for doing research in Pakistan. Because what do I mean by space? You need to be able to have an environment where you can have a community of scholars who are actively working on projects, who are hiring young research teams who are going into the fields to collect data. You need to have the infrastructure to hire them, to place them, to finance them, and so on. And all of that, just because in our, unfortunately, universities, that culture, tradition is not there. First, hoped that we would find that space. When we did not, we kind of almost had to, not almost, we did create it ourselves. And the nice thing is that, and this is the fun of doing things in Pakistan, that you get a very clear sort of feedback, which is that there was a great vacuum, the need was there, and so even though we had no money and so on, yet because we were doing something that there was really a great need of, we were able to put resources together. We were able to get grants and things like that. So it's really something that I personally feel very passionately about. It's something that has grown from just 2 people to over 160 people. There are 23 different projects being done throughout the country. We are now going into teaching as well, training as well, working with the government, working with the civil service, doing big data analytics and things like that. So it's something that's moving fast. And if some of you are interested in doing economic research in Pakistan, you should definitely check out CERT and come to us.
I think maybe it's an open floor now. Is that for Q&A?
Thank you. So what I'm going to try and do is maybe take a host of questions, have Atif answer them, and honestly try and end the conversation like a minute before 8. So there are a couple of mics. Roya has one over here, and Mahat has another one over there. So please just raise your hands. I'll try and take as many of you as I possibly can. Please do me a favor. Uncle, auntie style, please don't comment. If you have a question, make it short, make it brief. Don't tell us about your family and stuff like that. So that everyone gets a chance to ask this great man a question. Thanks.
Thank you for coming to speak with us. I think I can speak for all of us when I say it was very informative. I know you mentioned effective taxation as a form of revenue generation in Pakistan, but given the consequences of Pakistan's short-term mindset, including the high levels of debt, a lack of investment, negative net exports, how else can we finance these investments in domestic productivity?
The gentleman over there, and we'll move to the right-hand side for the next round of questions.
Well, thank you. I have 2 quick questions. First one is about vested interests and powerful vested interests. And it seems to me that the powerful interests the way this could change is if they themselves see the benefit of making these changes. And I'm wondering if you know of any examples throughout the world where this has happened. Okay, my second question relates to, in China, there's been this explosion over the last 10 years of digital payments and going to a cashless economy. And I was wondering if you could comment on what you perceive to be the potential benefits of that and whether that's possible for Pakistan.
Thank you, Dr. Atif, for that great speech. Now, my question has to do about the social system of Pakistan. So, a lot of it depends around the landowner class, and kinship and patronage structures really are the fundamental unit of Pakistan society. Do you think that any kind of nation building would require a fundamental shift in the fundamental unit of Pakistan society, and would this require some kind of social revolution?
Okay, we'll take a couple more, Anand, and then the person back behind you.
Given what happened to previous governments that tried to take on the army regarding various issues, how can we incentivize Pakistan's leaders like Imran Khan to actually have courage? How can we get them to make change?
Yes. A fifth, and then we'll get some answers.
Thank you for speaking to all of us today. You spoke a lot about the importance of land taxes, but one argument against land taxes is that although you may be land rich, you'd be cash poor. So although the imputed value of your land is high and you have a higher tax liability, a lot of people don't actually have the cash to pay these taxes. How will you respond to that? Thank you.
So let me. So on the last, I'll start with the last question: land rich, cash poor. Well, that's actually exactly right. That's kind of the purpose as well of having this, which is the following. So you do it properly, you don't just have a very high gradually ramp up and things like that, but those are just the details. But the other thing you have to keep in mind is that when you do that, land values will actually come down naturally because you're taxing, you have to pay a tax. Land values will come down naturally. What that does is it actually, you may have a certain person in mind when you made that statement, but you have to think of the entire economy. There are a lot more people who don't have land, who have some ability to generate cash because they are smart, they're really, entrepreneurs and so on. Right now, you have a very high land value and it raises the entry barrier for them to enter. So this is exactly why this is actually more efficient, because what you're basically doing is you're charging a user cost for using land in a very desirable location. And you're basically telling the population, look, if you can generate this much revenue, come have it. Otherwise, give it to someone else. And giving to someone else might require you to sell that land. Yeah. And that's kind of the point, or part of the point, I should say. How can people have courage? I don't know, I have children and I wonder about these kind of questions often. It's like, how do you motivate people? Where does motivation, where does inspiration come from? I think these are like kind of stuff that we don't know where it comes from, but we know it does come sometimes. I think part of the reason is to, again, it's like you're trying to inspire people, you're trying to talk about it. I don't know, maybe it rubs off, maybe it doesn't, but there's not much else you can do about it, right? That's like, just like the stuff we do with our kids, right? Trying to inspire them, trying to make them courageous and things like that. You just talk about it. And there is a great power of ideas, communication, talking about it. That's something I fundamentally believe in. So I think that's all we can do really, nothing beyond that. There's a question about how to have the shift away from patronage. I think obviously it's a very valid and important question. The way things have, a lot of societies were like that historically, and they have, there is a sense in which this urbanization, modernization, those things naturally break away. So I'm not too worried about that as long as we can sort of put in place some mechanism that generates growth, because that's a natural process that happens. I mean, even like you can imagine, like once we come to Berkeley, I don't ask you aapka taya kaun hai, aapka chacha kaun hai. We don't care about those things. But if you were in Sialkot, I might ask you that question. So I think just different environments like kind of change, breaks these things up. That sort of happens naturally. This question of digital payment is a very important one, and I do agree with you that it's a very useful thing. We should really think of moving in this direction fast. It has multiple advantages. It leads to documentation, formalization of the economy. Corruption becomes harder. It becomes harder to hide assets and things like that. It makes the whole thing much more efficient. So I think that's a clear technology that we need to use. Can we convince vested interest to change itself? I think there are ways you can sometimes tweak things so that you kind of coax them into adopting change that you're trying to make. So. But it's more like a case-by-case kind of issue. But I think it is possible at some level that you can do it. There's some types of vested interest who are kind of hopeless. You just have to kind of put them in jail or something like that. There is this question of a very important question about how to finance investment. There are two. One is sort of public investment, which comes from the government. We do need to create some space there, and which is again, I think, things like land tax. If the government were to institute it, I would particularly dedicate it just for investment, especially in urban infrastructure type. But a lot of private investment. Now, private investment is interesting. I think that's where you have to think a bit more innovatively, and that's where thinking about, for example, contractual laws, property rights, how to incentivize. Like I was talking about the agriculture sector. And other countries have done ways in which you can start collateralizing the cash flow of the farmer producing the crop. He is then selling it to some firm, some rice mill or something like that. You can actually do a contract between the bank and the rice mill owner and the farmer, where you collateralize the entire cash flow chain and lend against that to the farmer, so they can put in the right technology on the ground. So there is a lot of this kind of stuff that you can do to generate investment and facilitate investment. And again, the government should be sort of thinking about ways of how they can promote it and creating the right environment for it.
We'll take a few questions on this side now, Roya.
Thank you for your talk. Maybe I misunderstood, but I'm curious how you can speak about compassion and human rights and freedoms and the economy without taking a moral stand against the military.
Mara? There are a couple of questions in the back.
Yeah.
Please.
My question is about the agricultural land reform, and accordingly, is the reforms of the tax reforms. This is my question. That will it not be better to focus on this? Okay. Dusra, let me know the reason why a Pakistani flies to Dubai and he behaves in a disciplined way. And he lands in New York, he's fine, he's standing in the line. So, how to bring that change? That is the change which is required.
Myra, do you have a question in the back?
Thank you for your talk. You identified short-termism as one of the obstacles to the kind of long-term planning that is needed, or the long-term thought that is needed in economic planning. And I'm wondering if you can speak to how the short-termness of democratic timelines might actually militate against the kind of long-termness there. Thank you.
And the gentleman in the back with the shirt over there.
There is a prevalent thought in Pakistan that a leader will come and it will fix all the issues. What do you think about the leadership? Is it like a leadership problem or the people problem?
Let me start with the military question. No, of course, I did not mean to imply that all is well with the military. I was only responding to the sort of maybe the size of the military or how much is spent on them and so on. Of course, I think if I understand sort of the premise of your question, it is extremely important that people have freedoms in the sense that that physical violence, whether coming from one institution or the other, is not used against them. Absolutely, there are absolutely no two ways about that. Number one. Number two, again, when I was talking about compassion, which is something you mentioned as well, that's exactly the point, that you have to show that you care about the people. You cannot treat them like that. Whether you're doing that to the police, whether you're doing that to the military, whether you're doing that to the goons who are under the cover of the politicians, no matter how you do it, or whether it's a free-for-all, like the sectarian stuff. So absolutely, and that's what I meant when I said, the government has to show compassion. It has to be seen that it cares. Yeah, I really don't want to sort of. It's really depressing when you talk about incidents that happened back in the day. It just seems like the government doesn't care, and that was actually the point. And whether it's the military, I don't think obviously an distinction there. Agriculture, land reform. It's an important topic. I think I would, when I was talking about land taxes and so on, there's this general thing about equality and competition. I think you really want to sort of, that's the broader concept, and we're running out of time, so I won't touch on tax reform thing, but I think this is important. Pakistani in Dubai versus Pakistani in Pakistan. I think again, I don't think that's, I don't, we had motorway, they put police on there. I think people drive on the motorway much better than they drive on GT road and things like that. So I think it's about people everywhere are the same, and at some broad level. That's why it's just to change the environment and they behave differently. We just need to change the environment, and I think that's that's the reason. Democratic, that's a very real issue. I think that's part of, Fukuyama, others, they have talked about this issue that in the state of level of development that Pakistan is at, there is this tension between democracy might not allow you to think long term and you really need to think long term. That is a problem. How do we they're out of it. I don't know, democracy obviously has some very nice normative qualities, and I like them as well. So this is but that's why we need sort of conversation, and we want to figure this thing out collectively. Countries have done this, so it is possible. Leadership versus people, does it come from leadership? Again, it's one of those questions that there is no right or wrong answer. It's a bit of both. But it's the people who elect the leadership. And I think, again, maybe we can end on this, what was being discussed earlier in terms of what we can do. I think the most important thing that we can do is sort of raise our voices about what is important to try to bring about change. I think maybe this is one thing I can say with more confidence, that this idea that someone else will change us is absolutely wrong, right? So change comes from within, change comes one person at a time. We should perhaps be more modest about this concept of change and say, okay, whatever change I can make, let me change one person and so on. And then on the broader level, let me talk about it. Let me be vocal about things that matter. I think when we stay quiet because it's someone else who's suffering, whose rights are being taken away or whatever, that mentality we need to get out of. Thank you very much.